All right. I want to welcome Dwayne Morris. He's volunteering his time to be with us tonight. He's the founder of On Reasonable Ground, which works with students from UW. And I'm going to steal your thunder by trying to introduce you here. Just really, you're an expert in apologetics. Had some time to talk with you, and I learned a lot from our time together. And I think that'll be the same for all of you, and kind of excited to have this discussion tonight. Just in terms of what to expect, we're going to go through some Q&A together, but then we're going to turn it back to you. We're going to take 15 minutes at each table, write down questions that you have, kind of just discuss it together, and then choose 1 or 2 questions per table that you want to ask back up to here, and then we'll bring those up for discussion. We'll have 40 to 45 minutes to talk through that. So with that, Dwayne, so tell us a little bit about yourself. What drew you to apologetics? Yeah.
My
YouTube. Sabotaged you. There you go.
All right, we're on. My name's Dwayne Morris. Just excited to be with you guys. It's been something we've been talking about doing for a year, and so we found a time to do it, and glad you're here with us. And it's a pleasure just to talk about our faith together, and if that's not something you're so sure about, then I'm thrilled that you're here to think about things. What question will we talk about here?
All right. So let's start with what drew you to the field of Christian apologetics, and then how this has shaped your ministry. And by the way, I'm going to switch with you because yours is much more quiet. There we go.
I'm louder now. There we go. We'll get to what apologetics is here in a moment, but what drew me to it was growing up, I always thought if this faith and all the things we say about it are true, then there's got to be some good reasons for that. And it can't just be, well, that's what the Bible says. And that always bothered me. And I'd hear answers to questions that peers would ask, and listen to that and just think, we've got to have something better than the things I'm hearing. If that's the best answer, not very many people are going to buy into that. So that would bother me, and it motivated me to want to have better answers. Not in, to preclude the Bible, but how do you get more as to why would the Bible even say it? Why would God say that? Doesn't it make sense in more ways? So when I learned what apologetics was, I said, well, that's exactly what I'm talking about. And that really motivated me to want to learn more about that field. So in college, I got to take an apologetics class at the Bible college I was at, and honestly, it wasn't very good. It was taught by a guy that's not on his field, but he really cared about the subject. And so that came out from him, but it really made me think about how interesting this could be, and then I saw that, gosh, there's so much in this subject. This is what I really want to learn about. So it really opened up that door for me, and then I went to seminary to actually get a degree in apologetics. I ended up studying philosophy of religion and getting into far more than apologetics, which was a little bit over my head. But the goal was I wanted to really learn how to defend the faith. And that was kind of what's led to then the road I've gone to up to now.
Awesome, yeah. Thanks. We keep using the word apologetics, mm-hmm. And if you came here wondering what the heck apologetics was, this and you're pretty kind of still wondering right now. Can you share with us what apologetics is? What it is?
Right, so it's not apologizing, but apologetics is basically the defense of a faith, or what maybe more specifically, a defense of a belief system. So when we talk about Christian apologetics, what we're talking about is the defense of the Christian faith, or the Christian belief system. The word apologetics comes from a Greek word apologia that just means to give a defense, but we don't have a word that means give a defense. We just say give a defense, right? So in translating that, we just made a new word with the Greek letters. And that's how you got apologetics from the word apologia. It's in the Bible, in the New Testament, I think 3 times, maybe 4. the most famous being 1 Peter 3:15, where it says, always be ready to give a defense. Give a defense, that's apologia, the word. So always be ready to give a defense to anyone who asks you the reason for the hope that is in you. And then it says, but do this with gentleness and respect, which sometimes can be the hardest part. Is I actually have an answer to this question, but they're not listening to the answer, and now I've lost all my gentleness and respect, or whatever. And then you're like, okay, now my answer doesn't even matter. But those are challenges.
So I'm just not going to use this because it's not loud. So you mentioned defending the faith. Right? What's the purpose of that? Why do we defend the faith with believers and skeptics and non-believers?
Yeah, this is really important. So for fellow Christians, it's because we have real questions and we want to dive into those questions. We want to go deeper in our faith. We want to feel free to ask, the things that we wonder about and take those things seriously and just learn. And so we want to be able to dive into questions and for the purpose of learning and growing and being able to explain things to others or our kids or whatever. It's where it gets maybe a little tricky is with the non-believer, where it's, okay, what's my purpose? I want to defend the faith with this person. Is it that I want to, because I want to convert them, I want them to agree with me right now? And that can be a temptation. I would say that's not the purpose. It's, I want them to see that some of the things that they maybe haven't really thought make much sense actually make some sense. I want them to be able to see that there's more to think about here than they thought about before. That this is actually might be interesting. And if they start to see, okay, so it's not just the Bible said so, there's more to it. Like, that's the unique thing amongst religions. Because so often in religion, it's just, well, that's what it says, that's what it says, that's what that one says. So you're introducing a whole new category in that kind of a discussion. And it's the goal is to help them think about things maybe they never thought about before, to see it in a whole different way. And so really, I could narrow it down to just the goal is to help people think about our faith, as opposed to show them they're wrong, convince them I'm right, convert them right now. That's going to be, that's something maybe I hope that they would see down the road or over time. But if that's what I'm thinking right now, I'm probably not going to do it very well. And so it's, what can I contribute right now based on what we're talking about? Okay, well, this maybe will be helpful. And hopefully they want to talk again. If they want to talk more later or a second time, that's a win. Because that means we did a good job and it was interesting to them that they want to talk more. So.
That's good. And kind of leads to the next question, which is how do you see apologetics and evangelism working together in the context of sharing our Christian faith with others?
Yeah, this builds right on that, then kind of the next stage of what I was talking about. With the temptation of evangelism, well, I just want to share the gospel, and I've talked to people that are like, if I don't share the gospel with them, though, aren't I just screwing up the opportunity to have an opportunity? Well, you got to try to recognize where a person's at and what actually is interesting to them. What are they wondering about? Yes, I want to share the gospel. Yes, I want to talk about Jesus dying for our sin. I even want to talk about the resurrection, things like that, Jesus specifically. But that might not be the point they're at, that they're ready for that discussion. Or maybe they've heard that and that's what they're ridiculing. And they just think it doesn't make sense because of the way it's been presented to them. And so I want to know what are the questions they're having that we can talk about? What are the things they wonder about? And they say, well, this doesn't make any sense to me, whatever it is. Well, I could say, well, you just need to know the gospel, though. And then they're like, well, that still doesn't answer anything that I wonder about. And so it's, how can I address the questions that they're wondering about? And I can give input to that. And as we talk about that, and now they start to say, okay, well, that actually makes sense. Well, then they're interested in actually maybe asking some more questions. Okay, I got another one, right? Or maybe it's a month later, and they want to talk about something else, or something came up on the news, and like, I got a question for you. What do you think about this? But why are they doing it? Well, because they had a positive conversation with you and it was interesting, so now I want to talk more. Yes, at some point, I hope that it gets to where we're like, what do you understand about the gospel? But rather than me telling them that, I probably want to see, well, what do they say it is? Like, what do you say the central message of the Christian faith is? And then you're going to find out a lot. But I'm probably not going to start there. We're having our first conversation we ever had. What do you understand? Well, I mean, maybe, but more likely, it's building some rapport by actually addressing the questions they're having. We don't address the questions they're raising. They're like, it's not interesting to talk to you. I don't want to have to talk anymore. And so those things are setting the stage. Some people talk about it as it's like the sowing of the seed, but whereas the quote unquote evangelism is like the harvesting, right? It's like it's seed sowing to where we want to see some things start to grow, start to change. And if they just go, wow, you know what, that actually makes sense, you probably just had a great conversation, and that's a huge step. So.
Well, one of the things you did for us was you came up with a list of questions that are really common in apologetics that you think help as an entry point into the field of apologetics. So
that might be interesting.
Huh?
That might be interesting.
I read them; they were interesting. Yeah, I wanted to dive into those. We're going to go through five questions, and then once we get through those questions, then it'll be time for everyone to kind of reflect on what we've talked about and also share. Thank you. Thanks, Justin.
Is that for you?
Oh, I know. I think it's for you because you're almost out, right? That's for him, right? Yeah, good.
Thank
Always making sure we got redundancy in there. Once we go through these questions, then we'll have a chance to reflect on those questions, write down some of your own questions. Maybe it's doubts that you've experienced, or questions you typically get from people in your life that you want to bring up and discuss. But we'll start with these and go from there. All right. So next slide. Well, these are all of them. We're going to go to the first one. All right. So, what conditions are necessary for us to trust the Bible, and what evidence do we have for these things?
Easy one. No, this is a great question. There's a lot to this. This is not what I want to talk about with someone. Like, I'm not going to be like, I want to talk to them about the Bible. That's not what I would love to talk about. But they got questions, though. I got to talk about this, because this is where their questions are. We'll get into the stuff we want to talk about. This is the stuff I might need to talk about to show, and not necessarily to show that it's God's word, but just to show that this is reliable at all, and that it's worth even looking into. Those kind of questions, okay? So, really I see that there's four things. First is, do we have the right text? Some people think it's all been changed. It's been altered, manipulated over the years. Do we have authors? Secondly, do we have authors who actually would be in an eyewitness time frame? Or are they people who are writing way later after everyone's dead? That's a big question. Do we have authors who are intending to write accurately? Or are they just trying to tell a story? And then do we find that they get anything correct in the sense of where things are being corroborated by other authors in the similar time period? Or is it stuff that nobody says anything else about and it's completely anomalous? That would raise some questions. On the other hand, if people are corroborating things, that would raise other questions as to why, right? So on the first one, we've got manuscript evidence. You have over 53, maybe over 5,400 Greek manuscripts now. Now, that's not an entirety, that's some portion of different manuscripts. I believe the number it's 50 or it might be 60 that are the entire 27 books. But you have many manuscripts that are single books or groups of books. So maybe like the four Gospels in one text, or Luke and Acts together. So when you take all that information from all of these manuscripts, now you go through and you do an examination. Now there are things that are different and they're looking for discrepancies. But there are things that are different. There might be different spellings of words, which is not too hard to figure out. If 18 times it's one way and one time it's the other way, you're like, well, that was probably spelled wrong. And if that's not even the right spelling of the word, it's probably a mistake. Right? That's not hard to figure out, but that would get tallied up if they were tallying. Sometimes they switch orders. That doesn't change anything. If you understand like word order languages versus word form languages, that you're dealing with a word form language. It's not an issue. Someone in English might be like, "Whoa, that's a change." Well, no, that's not. The thing that comes to the heart of it, though, is there's in the manuscripts they find things that aren't there early and then they appear. Other things that were there and then disappear. Now, those would be of concern. So that's what we really want to know about. If things have really been changed, things have been taken out or added, completely changed, then that stuff matters. Now, through all the manuscript evidence, they've been able to identify things that are where 1, 2, 3 manuscripts have a change, have an alteration. And what you'll see in your footnotes is 2 early manuscripts say this. Now they put the other thing because that's the most common. And they say, but, by the way, 2 manuscripts say it this way. Or early manuscripts, which means more than 3. Anytime they say early or late, they don't say 1, 2, or 3, that's more than 3. But they say that early manuscripts don't contain this verse or this section. So what they did is, well, we're going to tell you about every one of those because we have the information now. Well, what's interesting is, of all of the affected texts, compiled up when you take all the words in the New Testament and how many words are actually in question where it has one of these situations, of those where it's either was there and then isn't, or wasn't there and then is. This is called omissions or additions. Of those situations, it affects just over 0.5% of the New Testament. Now, is that fair to say that those parts are in question? Yes. And some of them are very likely not authentic. But it's documented. But here's what's fascinating. Based on that examination from all these texts, you have almost 99.5% authentic text, meaning there's no evidence of it being altered or changed in any way. And I think that's just amazing. What a fascinating statistic. To say like, okay, we have good evidence that it's not been manipulated and changed. Yes, we're going to be honest about the things when we have some evidence of it. And I think we should. That's not if something was added in, that's not a problem for the Bible, that's a problem for the person that added it in. That was wrong. Or something got taken out. The people that did that shouldn't have done it. But it's not like, oh, I can't trust. No, I got 99.5% that is shown to have no issues in the transmission of it over the centuries. And so then there's no reason to be questioning it. And we can be upfront about the parts that, okay, there's something to wonder about here. Same thing I do with other historical authors, Aristotelian, study, people that study that. They're like, okay, well, these parts of Aristotle's works are in question. I think maybe one of his understudies wrote it. But what do? We don't throw out Aristotle, right? We'd like, okay, well, we just take that into account. Same thing. So.
Next slide, Ron.
Well, that was only part 1.
Oh.
Now, I'm gonna keep going. On the authors, now, how do we know if we have authors that know what they're talking about? Well, we want to be contemporaries. But all the critics give us at least 6, maybe 7 works of Paul. They say, yeah, they're authentic to Paul. Now that puts those early. Includes Romans and 1 Corinthians, which we had only those 2 books, that's all we need. But but then you go to the end of Acts, and what do you find at the end of Acts? Paul's in prison. Here's a fascinating thing. Why doesn't it write one more verse and tell us about how Paul got executed? Wouldn't that be of interest if you're writing the history of the church? So you think, well, what's the reason for why I wouldn't add one more verse? Well, the simplest answer is because it hadn't happened yet. Now, if it hadn't happened yet, he said, and Acts is written before Paul's death. Well, Paul dies in 64 or 65. that would put Acts by 64. Just follow the timeline reasoning. I'm gonna stretch it as far as I can. That puts it by 64. And it says he's been there for 2 years at that point, in that last verse of Acts. Okay, in prison for 2 years. Okay, well, what do we know about Acts? We know Acts is part 2, and Luke came first. So now Luke's earlier than that. And every critic agrees Mark was one of the sources used by Luke. Well, then that's a freebie. Okay, so there's that. There's 3 books, which are almost half the New Testament right there, as early in the eyewitness time frame. Then if you add the Paul's works, it's like, okay, well, we got a whole bunch. We got a lot here. And if that's all we have, and we have to disregard the rest, which I don't agree with, I don't think we should, but if that was the case, we're fine. So, did they try to write things that are authentic? Or, that try to write things that are accurate? Like, was that their intent? Well, you examine things like, what kind of things do they utilize? Do they give us names, dates, and places and try to match them up? And things that you can test? Or do they talk about fake places or fake people, right? Well, obvious stuff. And I just like to read that example. Actually, I can't see, so can you?
Yeah.
I need glasses.
Give me the
Luke 3. I'm in Luke, I think.
No, you're in John.
Oh. Evidence I can't see. Luke 3, 1 and 2. Mm-hmm. Or 2 and 3, I think. Start in 1.
Sorry, which chapter?
Luke 3.
Luke 3, verses 2 and 3.
1, start 1.
All right. Verse 1.
Yeah.
Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip was tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias was the tetrarch of Abilene, all pronounced wrong. In the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness.
Good enough. John the Baptist. Now, if you're not trying to be accurate, you don't add any of that. Right? There's no reason, I'm making up a story, so I'm not going to put any of that. All that can be tested and shown exactly when that is. Right? So you're just looking for things like that. Okay, well, it looks like somebody's trying to be accurate. Plus, at the beginning of Luke, he says he's trying to be accurate. I'm going to write an orderly account. So that you got to take that into account if you're, giving any respect to an author. And then we look for corroboration, and there's amazing sources. We're in the first and early second century of Roman sources talking about things in the that we find in the Gospels, and the one I'll just mention one, and the most famous, Tacitus, the Roman historian, talking about Jesus being executed, but based on an accusation from the religious leaders, and under Pontius Pilate, and he suffered the extreme penalty known as crucifixion. He calls it the extreme penalty. But you see him acknowledging these things, not just that Jesus was, but okay, here's some really central historical, instances that he's pointing out, and key people. And he says it's during the reign of Tiberius. And so you're like, okay, well, those 4 key things in one or 2 sentences by Tiberius. You're like, okay, well, that's being confirmed. And guess what? The Gospels exist before he wrote. And so Gospels are actually primary. And there's other ones as well, but I'll let it go for now. So those are things that we want to see. That doesn't mean it's God's word, but that gives me reason to think I got a reliable text. Now I want to go farther. So, go.
Next question is, what is the evidence that Jesus is actually God?
All right. People get asked this question, and there's some not very good reasons that are given. This is one of those when I'm hearing people talking like, that's the reason? That's why we believe it? Most common, well, the Bible says so. And if you hear people say that and think, that person totally doesn't care about the Bible that you're saying that to. So they've discredited it already in their head. And so you say, well, I don't want to give that kind of answer. I've heard people say, well, because he was born of a virgin. Well, how did you know that he was born of a virgin, is the question. Because it was in the Bible. So they're doing chronology. Well, if he was born of a virgin, then he'd be, well, I guess, but how would you know that? Right? It's not, we don't go by chronology here. You're looking for a reason to believe something. So I would say there's 3 good reasons. Packaged together, it gets really strong. One is, now this one incorporates the scripture, but it's the fulfillment of messianic prophecy. You look at the prophecies, then you go and you look at what actually is accounted for. And you say, okay, well seems pretty unlikely. Well, there's actually figures on it that for someone to fulfill 8 or 10 of them is like 1 in 10 to the 17th. And then 14 of them is like it's outrageous. Already was, I guess. But they say, well, he's fulfilled, over 100 of them. And so then the argument was, well, it looks like they added those into the Old Testament. Yeah. Right? And then after the New Testament was written, then they added things in the Old Testament to make a little, look at that. And then we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, the most significant archaeological find. And they found, they're all there already. So you could do a fascinating study, and that's where really putting some work in and trying to assess, all of the correspondence between the Old Testament prophecy and what you find in the Gospels. But that's for someone who maybe has a history in the faith and has a respect for the Bible, or is Jewish, right? But if somebody's like, I don't care about the Bible, it's not going to go anywhere. But it has some merit, and so I'd maybe package it with other things. I wouldn't put that by itself. But the Lord Liar Lunatic is interesting. That's not saying the Bible said so, that's saying he said so, by the way. And then he said, well, how do we know he said so if it's not the Bible saying it? Well, it's because that's what he was put to death for. So we look at his death. And here's why he was executed. There's no other account in any historical document of him having some other crime. It's blasphemy. So then they say, okay, well, if that's what he's put to death for, then what follows from that? That's where you get C.S. Lewis's idea about, well, it's either a Lord, is he who we said he was, or he's some kind of crazy nutcase, or he's a malicious liar. And there's only 3 options. And you have to process through, like, why would that make sense? And that's a whole argument in itself that we could spend time on. But the most significant thing is the resurrection. And it's, did he rise from the dead or not? Well, if he's the Son of God, if that's what I'm going to say, well, he's God, but then he can't be dead. So if he's dead, that would actually trump the other 2. No matter how compelling those were, if he's dead, it doesn't matter. So you say, okay, then that's what is really at the center of it. Did he conquer death? If he conquered death, there's nothing else to call him but Lord and God. If he didn't, then he'd forget it all. Maybe some wisdom for life. That's about it. But it comes down to that. And it's not about the other, it's not about what the Bible is. Just, did he rise from the dead? Not saying, did he rise from the dead according to the Bible? I mean, in history, did he rise from the dead? If that's the case and he's not dead, then that's the most significant thing. You package all of those together, you're like, gosh, there's some pretty significant evidence for this fact. Yeah.
So, speaking of the resurrection, without referring to the Bible,
yeah.
How can we make a case for the resurrection?
All right, so this is the one I would want to talk about. I said earlier, I might not have to talk about stuff I don't want to talk about, but I want to talk about the resurrection. I want to talk about the gospel. Okay, yes, but maybe they're stuck on other things. We need to talk about those things first, but that's where they're at. If we get to talk about the resurrection, now I don't want to just say, well, the Bible said so. Look, it's right here. And show them, and they're like, now we're back to that. So, I want to give a historical reasoning for the resurrection itself. Now, there's a lot to this. You can go through a whole process of elimination, and books do this. They go through all the issues about an empty tomb and what could be. That's important because that's where the conversation is going to go after what I am going to say now. And so that's all worth learning. You get into conspiracy theories and maybe he didn't die and all that kind of stuff. But first, what I can do is say, the most attested event in the life of Jesus Christ is the crucifixion. And every source, there's 6 non-Christian sources that attest about the resurrection. Crucifixion. And then, of course, Christian sources that talk about the crucifixion. But it's the most referred to event. And really, it's not in dispute that he was crucified. So what we say, okay, well, what is of interest is what happened after that. We say, okay, well, after that, here's what we know. We know that the tomb was found empty. We know, I'm just going to list some facts. Some people call it minimal facts. I'm going to call it like basic facts. Because when they go minimal facts, they're saying, what will the critics give us? And going beyond the minimal is what I call basic facts, where it's most will grant it. So most critics will grant these things. But the tomb's found empty. We know that the disciples believed they saw him alive by their own testimony. Now, I didn't say that they saw him alive. I said they believed they saw him alive. Okay, so that's very specific. We know that there's a radical transformation of the disciples from men who are hiding and afraid for their lives to willingly dying. That's a radical transformation. We know that the Christian church begins in Jerusalem shortly after the crucifixion. And Christianity has its whole beginning there. We know that devout Jews who are opposed to false religion, like they're monotheists, they're not polytheistic Romans, right? But devout Jews are converting to follow this God after many of them wanted him dead. And then we know that the disciples themselves suffer and die for this message, claiming that it's true. And you say, okay, of the things that follow the crucifixion, what explains all of them? Okay, not just what explains the empty tomb, that's one of them, but what would explain all 6? Well, then there's you could add other things like James, his brother, converts. That's surprising, right? You add that. But anyway, what explains all those? Well, if they just went to the wrong tomb. It was a big tomb mix-up. Well, that explains the tomb being empty. It doesn't explain why anyone thought they saw him. It doesn't explain why they would start a new church. It doesn't explain. Also, if you never saw him, because then if you never talked to him, it was just a tomb mix-up. Why would you start a new church? Why would all these Jews be converting? Why would they give up their lives? That doesn't make sense. So it's not working. Oh, it was a big conspiracy, right? They stole the body. Okay, well, that explains why the tomb's empty. That explains why people thought they saw him, because they're lying. Explains starting a church because it was all a conspiracy and deceptive lie. It explains people converting because they were being deceived. But apparently the people that are doing that are now dying. That doesn't explain why they would die for it, because people don't die for something they know is a lie. You die for lies. People die for lies, but not something they know is a lie. You say, well, that would mean that's what was going on. That seems problematic. Well, that explains quite a few. And then you get to resurrection. You say, well, resurrection explains all of them. Explains why you'd start a new church. Explains why the tomb would be empty. Explains why people would think they saw him. Explains why the devout Jews would be converted. It explains the transformation, and explains why they give up their lives for the message. You say, well, that's called explanatory power, where it's like, what explains all the facts? Not just one fact, or 2 facts, or 3. What explains all the facts? And it's only so the answer you give is only the resurrection explains all the facts following the crucifixion. And if that's the case, it's the best explanation.
And you're saying the critics would agree with those 6?
Generally, I think you get up to about 70 to 80% on those. From what I've seen on the guy that does all the documenting this stuff.
It's outside of scripture that these 6 events are talked about.
Yeah, but I mean, with those facts, we're not saying that the Bible said them. We're just saying these are the facts that are agreed to by people. Now, the only people that are even disagreeing really are your biblical critics. It's not a common person that's even just that's at a point of disagreeing generally with those. So then it's a matter of, well, what explains it? I think resurrection explains it. Now, you come up with another option, and then we can assess it based on how does it explain things. And so I gave you 2 examples. Like they say, somebody might, of course, say the conspiracy theory. Well, let me look at how would that explain it. That explains this, explains that. What doesn't explain this one? And then I'm able to do that kind of assessing. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So if the critics agree with those 6 facts,
Generally, not 100% of them.
Generally.
Yeah.
what is their explanation for, or what's their reasoning for why they don't think he rose from the dead, based on those facts?
Well, they go
What
with
is
the most common one with your biblical critics, especially ones that might call themselves Christian, is they say we think it was that he never was buried in a tomb, and they say he was probably just buried in a graveyard. No one knows where his body went. Now, I would say that's sweeping it off, and it doesn't even explain anything about why people would be dying for it and thinking they saw him then. So but that's the most common one in your higher scholarship that I've seen, especially in the Jesus seminar, and where they will say, yeah, so that John Dominic Crossan was a key person, and that led that whole movement, and he's like, well, this is explanation. And so they're giving that kind of thing. There's a whole fun assessment of that explanation that he gives, that they would just be buried off somewhere else. And it's that if you got an order from Pilate and you to give the body to someone, and then you don't, we all know what happens. It's not like, oh, that's a good idea, right? It's like you just disobeyed a direct order, and no Roman executioner or anybody is going to be doing that. There's no reason to do it. But that would be to answer your question, the most common one that's utilized as alternative.
But that would be a counterpoint to the fact that he's not found in the tomb. But is there a counter argument that sort of reasons against all of the facts that were laid out, into one?
They're just think if I don't know about that, but I think that what they're saying is if I just deal with the empty tomb, I don't have to deal with the rest. They're gonna say, well, these people are just seeing things, or they're just saying stuff later. Because they also say, well, these aren't eyewitnesses, so that probably the testimony we're reading is, not from eyewitnesses. So they're gonna combine that claim to then say, so the people that we're getting this information from don't even know what they're talking about anyway. And then that's why what I was saying earlier about the end of Acts is really important to get that into the eyewitness time frame. Yeah, but we're going to come back to other questions.
Yeah, I want to pause on questions, but actually, I forgot to say this. Start right. You don't all have something, right? But there is a piece of paper there. But if stuff comes up as you're talking and we want to reflect that back afterwards, write it down so that we capture it, and then we're going to have time to ask questions. Those are also really good questions.
Right.
Okay. And next slide. How can we say Christianity is the truth and Jesus is the way in a world with so many other religions?
Right. I want to be brief on this one because I can be. This one gets people fired up because they'll be like, well, now you're what you're saying about other belief systems, right? Well, first off, we don't think everything is wrong in every other belief system. We're 100% right and you guys are 100% wrong. We're not saying that. We're saying we want to believe in what's completely true. The complete truth, not just half-truths. So it comes down to 2 things. Contradictory beliefs can't all be true at the same time. Just called logic. Okay? We say there's different perspectives on Jesus. Jesus is either some kind of prophet, he's a total farce and lying, deceiving people, or he's Son of God. Right? So he's nothing, something you shouldn't even listen to. He's a prophet, he's Son of God. Or until you say, okay, or he's a teacher, right? Great teacher. And so some religions say he's one of the other, right? And Islam would say he's a prophet. Some other religions would say, well, he's a prophet. Other, Judaism, well, he's not a prophet, he's not God, so he's the other one, or one of the other ones. And then Christianity saying he's the son of God. Okay, well, it can't all be true. So just by pure logic, we say, well, contradictory ideas on some premise can't all be true. And so it's going to narrow down just on that. And so if Christianity is correct about him, well, that's why we'd say that's the truth. Now, why would we say it's the way and not other things? This one, it seems so complicated, but honestly, we'll narrow it down to this. It's because only Jesus did anything about the problem. Right? So, Scott says, I have an idea of another way. Okay, what is it? Right? And now he shares. And now I evaluate that based on what does that do about the problem. He says, well, if you just do more good than bad, then that's it. That's the way. And the simple question is, well, what does that do about all the bad? Obviously nothing. Right? Well, how does that do anything about it? We have this problem. So now that means we got to back up and identify the problem, right? What the heck is the problem that something needs to be done about? And now we're in the sin problem. And if we're not going to acknowledge that, well, we got an issue, obviously. But we can identify, okay, here's the problem. We have been separated from God by sin. Well, only Jesus did anything about that. That's why I'm saying he's the way. If you have an idea of some other way, it's got to do something about the problem. How does it do something about that? And nothing does anything about it. No other option. So that's my brief one on that.
And then our last one is, why are morality and evil significant in making the case for the truth of Christianity?
This is fun. So, on morality, there's three perspectives. So, you could take a subjective view of morality, that is just everybody decides for themselves what's true, and whatever they decide is the truth for them. You could say that morality is a collective called moral relativism or cultural relativism. And so by a collective agreement, cultures come to an idea and that becomes the truth for that culture, but it kind of stays within the bounds of that particular society and it doesn't cross over. Or you say morality is objective. It's subjective and it means it's independent of any society or any person. It has nothing to do with what anybody thinks. What it is what it is, all on its own. That's the objective view. Now, Christianity relies on the objective view. But here's what you find. It says, when you get into evil, you're like, well, actually, evil only exists on the objective view. And so if someone wants to say, well, true morality is subjective, and so the question is, so do you think there's evil? And then you're going to find that they're exposed. And they're saying, well, no, there's no evil. Or they might say, well, what do you mean? I mean, it's not just something we don't like. Evil is not just, well, I don't like that. Or our culture doesn't like that. It's like, that's not evil. I mean, that's not sufficient. Evil is much deeper. It's not, well, bikes being stolen. That's not what we're talking about. Right? So we say, on a subjective view, there can't be evil. But same is true on the culturally relative view. There can't be evil in that view. It's just, well, we don't like that collectively, but who are we to say about the other people? We don't think you should exterminate a race in Germany, right? But who are we to say about what they do? And if they would have just stayed in Germany, it'd have been fine. The problem, this is what the relatives would have to say. The problem is, they went outside the borders of Germany. So now we have to do something about it. Because they're forcing it on us. But if they would have just stayed there, then who are we to say? That's ridiculous, right? So, but the point you start to see is, well, you can't say anything's evil. You just have to say you don't like it. Only one that allows us to say things are evil is objective morality. You're saying there's actually a fact of the matter that's independent of us. And then you suddenly get into, and where the heck would that come from? This objectiveness of it that distinguishes good and evil. And you start out the conversation with, okay, well, so do you think there's evil? Okay, yes, hopefully, right? We're hoping they'll say, yes, there's evil. But that would mean there's good too, right? Yeah, so there must be something that distinguishes the two. Now we just got three affirmatives. They're like, yeah, there's a distinction between them. Something distinguishes the two. So, okay, that thing that distinguishes the two is what we call the moral law. Now, if you don't want to call it the moral law, it's fine. What do you call it? But whatever it's called something. It's a thing, and it's this guiding principle that distinguishes good and evil for us, and that we have a sense of obligation to. And everybody knows it. You say, okay, well, I think we can get agreement on that if I would go into that discussion and take somebody down that. Okay, yes, you agree there's evil. Okay, so then you agree there's good, and you agree there's something that distinguishes the two. And that's what we call morality or moral law. Should get yeses. Okay? But it started with, we already got objective. It's objective. Okay, well, who gets to distinguish it? Is the next question. None of us. Nobody who I could talk to in the world. It's not them. Right? Who gets to decide? That's the question I'm posing. Now, we don't want to see them think about it and go, okay, well, here's what I think. Here's their explanation. It's not going to be very good. And then we can talk about it. Obviously, that's going towards, there has to be someone that's greater than us, who has authority, has a mind that has authority to determine this distinction. And that's what we call God, obviously. So, yeah.
That's a really good entry point to the discussion about that. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to step out of the way so you can see this. But we're going to go take about 15 minutes and just kind of process with each other what you found interesting, any questions that this brought up for you. Also, if there are any questions you have that you came into tonight with that you want to share and ask, I'm going to ask that for each table, we have like a scribe or secretary, one person who is going to be in charge of writing down the questions that the group has. And then you're going to nominate one or two of those questions from your table. Let's say 2 questions, and then we'll go round robin and see how far we get. So we'll nominate 2 questions from each table that we want to share at the table, and we'll basically go around and bring those up and talk through.